Hi everyone, it's Roya from Pain Gains Coaching and the Pain Gains Podcast. Welcome to my first official public YouTube video. As promised, here is the visual recording of episode 6, where you'll be able to access the slides and additional resources referenced in today's episode. The Pain Gains Podcast is available on a variety of platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Check out the direct link in the description below, along with the links to my coaching services and other socials. I hope you enjoy. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar as part of our Fall Speaker Series. My name is Raji Auchla, the Language Helplines and Special Projects Manager at Distress Centres of Greater Toronto, and I am your moderator for this evening. Distress Centres of Greater Toronto would like to begin by acknowledging the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. We also acknowledge that Toronto and Peel region is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. We would like to thank Pace Law for sponsoring this webinar. Tonight's webinar is titled Compassion Fatigue 101, and we are fortunate to have Nadia C. Prasad and Aurora Janemi sharing their knowledge with us. Nadia C. Prasad is a program coordinator at the North Branch of DCGTA. She is a medical school graduate and was a prior DC volunteer before assuming her current role. She is an aspiring psychotherapist and is familiar with compassion fatigue from both a personal as well as a professional standpoint. Nadia enjoys everything food related and dislikes delays on the TTC. Aurora Janemi is a health, movement, and accessibility advocate currently working as an adult rehab occupational therapist, while running her private coaching and consulting practice on the side. She has worked with individual groups and organizations as a therapist, coach, mentor, and consultant, both locally and internationally. She is passionate about supporting her clients to rise from their pain, rise into their potential, and she believes that with the right support, education, mindset, and action plan, mountains can move molehills and challenges become victories that are overcome one step at a time. Roy is passionate about seeking and educating individuals around such topics as compassion fatigue and how to develop tools for self-care. You can connect with Roy on Instagram at Pain Gains Official and through her website and blog at www.paingains.com. Thank you, ladies, for being here tonight. I'm going to hand it over to you guys now.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Roya, and we're going to dive right into this. So as Raji said, I am an occupational therapist. And so I've worked in a couple of different areas of practice. Most recently, I've spent the last 2.5 years in adult rehab in community practice, and now currently working with a primary focus on concussion management. So clients dealing with post-concussive syndrome. And so, my journey through compassion fatigue, and the reason why I'm passionate about it is actually somewhat personal. As an occupational therapist, when I was working in the community, and I still do, but, when I was working full-time in the community, I realized that there was a point in time where I actually didn't even realize that I hadn't taken a vacation in over 1.5 years. And I don't know how much you know about community healthcare, but ultimately what tends to happen is referrals are coming in constantly, and there's always, as with many things, there's more demand than resources. So, sometimes you push yourself beyond what's probably healthy or safe, and you lose that work-life balance. And when you're dealing with people who have complex medical conditions, cognitive delay, decreased functional mobility, home safety concerns, they're getting discharged from hospital due to various reasons, post-op surgeries, whether they're dealing with chemotherapy treatments or they're dealing with traumatic accidents. The reason why I might go into a person's home is quite broad. And all I usually get is a referral that says, please go do A, B, C, and D, home safety assessment, cognitive assessment, make sure client gets the adequate support services that they need. So we have a pretty basic idea of what's going on when we go to see clients in the homes. But, when you get there, oftentimes there's a lot more than what meets the eye, right? So, you might go into a person's home and it says bilateral below knee amputation. And then you go and you realize there's actually a lot more going on than just a below knee amputation. And so, then you start to think about services that they need to connect with and doing those referrals. And so, typically I would see around, on a good day, 4 clients a day, but sometimes you push it and you get to 5 to 6 clients a day. I think the most I ever did was 7, and you're driving around, right, a region. So basically what happened was I wanted to meet the demands that were presented, and I was pushing myself. And so I think about a year and a half in, I realized I hadn't taken a proper holiday. And actually it was during a client session. I was probably on to client number 5 for the day. And my body, in terms of how it alerts me to, how it kind of gives me warning signs, is my pain response kicks in, whether that's, in my hands or in my knee or whatever. That's normally how I tune into the fact that, okay, maybe I'm pushing myself a bit too hard. So I was with a client, and partway through my assessment, I started to get really bad chest pain. And I kind of thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, I'm not, as I'm doing my assessment, crunch down in really bad posture, because in people's homes, you don't always have ergonomic settings. You just do what you can. And so I'm crunched down doing my assessment, and I'm trying to be with this client and, experiencing my own chest pain during the session. I was able to finish the assessment, went to my car, did some deep breathing, some meditation. I had one more patient at the end of the day, and it was a quick one. He was a couple minutes away, and I thought, okay, I got to go see him. Like, it's just a really quick one. So I pushed myself again to go and see this client, saw him afterwards. I ended up in a Tim Hortons parking lot, short distance away from the client's house. And I was starting to panic because this chest pain wasn't going away. But of course, I knew the signs of a heart attack. So I knew, I wasn't getting numbness down my arm. So I was pretty clear, it probably wasn't that. But, I ended up having to reach out to a friend of mine who was online. He was, I think, traveling in Europe or something at the time. And, quickly did what I needed to do to help calm my nervous system down. And he kind of helped me through some guided meditation in that moment, because I was having a hard time deciding whether I should go to the emergency or if I should go home and monitor. So then, I ended up going home, just having enough knowledge to know that it probably wasn't a heart attack and it was just stress induced. And then the next day, the symptoms had continued. So basically, long story short, I went to Emerge. And of course, I was diagnosed with costochondritis, which is inflammation of the intercostal muscles and around the chest. And so, again, my body telling me that I'd pushed it too far, right? So that was basically a big warning sign, a big wake-up call. And what ended up happening is I took 2 holidays within a span of 6 months after that. So it's just, that's kind of my journey. And that's part of why I ended up wanting to do some coaching on the side, because I realized there's a gap in service delivery a lot of times for people. And so, that's kind of my journey with compassion fatigue. And I'm going to pass it over to Nadia.
All right. Thank you, Roya, for sharing your story with us. When Roya and I began collaborating on this topic, we realized that we both had very personal stories attached to it. And although our stories are different, I think you'll see some similarities. So I'd like to share a little bit about my own, what I call burnout, although I think burnout and compassion fatigue are closely related in terms of signs and symptoms and what we can do about it. So my burnout began in medical school. So I went to medical school in the Caribbean. I was in St. Lucia for 2 years. I moved to Chicago and I did 2 years there. Then I came back to Toronto and I had one exam that was separating me from becoming a doctor. And this is a 9-hour board exam, so it's pretty rigorous. There's a lot of pressure at that point to do well because it's pass fail. Um, so I was already under a lot of stress just knowing the repercussions of this. So I did the exam the first time and I failed it, which in itself is pretty devastating for a medical student. Failing a big board exam has consequences on the rest of your career. Um, but I know I wanted to push through. So I did it a second time. The second time I wrote this exam, I absolutely froze. So what happened is for almost 9 hours, I sat down in the room. I'm clicking on the answer choices, and it's a multiple choice exam. And a lot of times I'm going on autopilot. I didn't really register everything on the paper. And by the end of it, I left the room and I remember walking out feeling like shell shocked. I walked out and it was a 10-minute walk between where the exam room was and where my home was. And I remember walking home and stopping at a church. And I walked in. I'm not even of that denomination. It just felt like a peaceful place to be. And I sat down and I cried for about an hour. I just sat and I thought, and all I can think about is the questions that were on that exam and the answers. And in my mind, all the right answers were coming, but I knew I didn't click them. So at that point, I had a good idea that it wasn't going to be an awesome result. So coming out of there, we had to wait 2 weeks, which again is pretty stressful. At the end of 2 weeks, you get your results, and sure enough, I failed on a scale of 0 to 300. I failed by 1 point. So thinking about that was just, very heartbreaking for me. At that point, I felt like a failure. I felt very embarrassed. I felt like I'm not going to do this. I didn't want to tell a lot of people about it. I just withdrew quite a lot. And I was trying to figure out how do I push past this? Because that was the point where I realized I burnt out, like I froze. That was my physical manifestation of burnout, was that I froze. And the way my school worked is that you have 3 shots and then you're kicked out. So I had one shot left, one exam left, and I really had to figure out how to dig deep and get beyond that point of burnout. And for me, the burnout was on many different levels. The emotions that I just spoke about, and then also I felt completely fatigued. My body was tired. I was mentally tired. I would hold tension a lot in my jaws, and I had a lot of jaw pain. Um, there was just a lot of things. My sleep was horrible. I developed pretty horrible insomnia after that. So it ended up being a very long period of time. Um, and when said that I had to dig deep, what I did was I thought about what was the reason that I started this journey. And the reason I started medical school was with the intention of doing psychiatry, because I love talking to people and helping them through difficult times in life. So I started to look for volunteer opportunities that would connect me to that. And that's what led me to the distress centers. So when I found it and I started training and I started taking calls, I felt really inspired by it. I felt like the reason that I started this came alive again. And for me, that was very powerful. Whenever I'm on calls up to now and I'm listening to people's stories, I feel like it's so real and so raw. And it's a privilege to be a part of their pain and part of their stories. And I wish at the time that I knew what was happening with myself. Um, because at the time I didn't realize I was burnt out. I just felt like I was failing. So, my hope in this presentation is that Roy and I could talk a little bit about, the signs of burnout, the symptoms, what you can do about it. So hopefully we can spread some awareness here today and create a little less shame around it. So with that, I'm going to get into what exactly is burnout, and Roya is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so thank you so much, Nadia. Also, I just want to echo that comment about, shame is really powerful, because a lot of people feel shame, right, when they're starting to feel burnout. And so we're gonna try and get rid of that shame and replace it with compassion for yourself. And so to do that, we're going to talk about what compassion fatigue is. So to understand compassion fatigue, it's really, really important to understand empathy. Okay, so what is empathy? Okay, it's the ability to notice, share and experience the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of another person, animal, or even a fictional character. Okay, developing empathy is key to establishing relationships and showing compassion. So we have a question for you: is why do you think this is so? If anyone wants to put comments for us, why is developing empathy key to establishing relationships and showing compassion?
All right, let's, if there's no thoughts around this, let's clue in as to why is this so?
Yeah. So developing empathy enhances the ability to understand another person's perspective, which helps us support other people. Okay, so how much empathy do we really have in this world right now? That's another question for you.
Yeah, that is quite the question. Especially right now with COVID in the world. Are we empathetic? Are we not?
Yeah, there's a lot of mixed messages happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some comments coming up. So empathy shows you're able to understand without showing pity. Thank you, Nikki. Because only by sharing can you develop true relationships. Absolutely. Shayla, to be able to relate to them, let them know they are not alone, and to support them appropriately. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You are able to connect with other people as you are being authentic. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All of this is great.
Yeah.
It allows us to relate with other people and vice versa. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's get into it. I think a lot of people hit the nail on the head.
Okay, so yeah.
So we were also talking about how much empathy is really present in the world right now. So, Roya?
So did you want me to go with that one, Nadia?
Sure.
Or was that you?
It's you.
I thought so. Okay. Just making sure. Okay. So according to the research done by the University of Michigan and the University of Rochester Medical Center, they found that empathy among students has actually declined by more than 40% compared to the late 1970s. Okay, so this was done by Dr. Sid, and he says that, so Dr. Sid says that we live in a world that desperately needs more compassion. Okay, so what does this mean for people in professions that employ empathy? We are so needed in this world, guys. Like everybody who's on this call, we're needed in this world because there's such a decrease in the numbers of empathetic people. And taking care of ourselves ensures that there are enough of us around to do the work that's super, super important. Okay.
Oh, we are important humans. So let's talk about this. Compassion fatigue sounds like a big word. How is it actually defined? So a state of exhaustion and dysfunction, biologically, physiologically, and emotionally, and as a result of prolonged exposure to compassion stress. It's also known as vicarious trauma, VT, in helping professions. VT refers to the experience of a helping professional developing his or her own trauma or symptoms as a result of continuously working with traumatized people. And nowadays, we're seeing higher levels of compassion fatigue in the general public. So let's think as to why is that so? Why do we have more compassion fatigue? Okay.
I think there might be a bit of a delay with messages coming through, so I'm just going to see. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, any ideas about why we're seeing higher levels of compassion fatigue in the general public? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.
So I guess let's talk about that a little bit. I see Raji saying people are always on the go. We are busy and forget to take care of ourselves, and that's so true. I think we live in a very busy world, and we're always so go 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 that we just we don't have time for ourselves. Laurie's hitting on an important point as well, saying we live with a 24/7 news cycle that exposes us to so much sad and disturbing news.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I see another comment saying, I think due to COVID and the social isolation and the fact that people work less and that people can see the pain of others better. That's a really profound statement, that we're more in tune with each other because of COVID. So we're expressing more compassion and empathy, and maybe that's what it is, that we're just getting burnt out by it. I see a lot of great comments here talking about the sandwich generation. Yep, the pressures from below and above. I see a lot of COVID statements. Cell phones. So he's talking about cell phones. Yeah. And maybe attached to cell phones, also social media. We're comparing ourselves to other people. Maybe that has something to do with it. Anthony saying, I think many people forget to check in on themselves and how other people's pain and problems can impact them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think these are great comments by everyone, that there's just so much going on. And when we're always trying to take care of other people, it can be really hard to take care of ourselves. So let's get into that a little bit. We have great ideas as to what's creating these higher levels of compassion fatigue, but what does that actually look like in us? So Raya and I came up with this great chart that shows really how wide the span of symptoms and signs are. And I'm going to kick us off by talking about some of the physical symptoms. And one is our appetite or eating. How many of us, we have a bad day and we open a bag of chips and we're like, oh, this is so good. Or
I've done it.
You've done it. Yeah, I've done it too. For me, it's cake and cookies. I think we all have our weaknesses.
Yeah.
For other people, they just lose their appetite. So we see in eating, it can go both ways. Sleep can go both ways too, where for some people, they're so tired that they just always feel tired in spite of getting rest, like they never feel rejuvenated. Um, and we see the opposite as well, where some people can't sleep at all. So we see sleep going in both directions. You would have heard from Roya and I's story about the muscle tension that we experience. For Roya, it was her chest, which is quite physical. For me, it was my jaws. So we see that when we hold tension in our body, we all hold in different areas. And I challenge everybody to think about that. When you're tense, what do? Do you clamp up your hands? Do you lock your jaws? Do you shrug your shoulders? Because it starts wearing out over time. And Roya mentioned, chronic pain. Maybe as a result of that tension, we're chronically in physical pain.
Yeah, so all of this is so important. And we're going to actually, a lot of those symptoms of physical pain, what do you think it can do to your thinking, to your cognition, right? If you are not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're feeling tension, you're in pain. What are the chances that you might have difficulties concentrating, or you might have difficulties processing information, whether that's verbal information or nonverbal reading versus somebody talking to you? And also it may lead to something called cognitive fatigue. So if you're physically tired, what's your stamina in terms of thinking and processing, right? Like, are you more likely to by 3 o'clock in the afternoon feel like you're about to pass out because your brain just can't go anymore? Because we have physical fatigue, but physical and cognitive fatigue are interrelated a lot of the times. And then also the question is memory, right? If we're feeling the signs of burnout, sometimes we might notice that we're not remembering things as well, short term or long term. And then lastly, difficulty paying attention. Okay, so that's another area where you might start to notice you're easily distractible, or you can't focus on a task for the same amount of time that you normally would if you weren't starting to feel burnt out and feel like compassion fatigue was getting to you.
So I see Lise asking a question, which was the exact question that I thought when I started learning more about this. Doesn't this sound like depression? Yep, it does sound a lot like depression. You do see quite a lot of overlap between the two. So I do agree with that comment. Is it the same? I think that's something that depends on your timeline. According to strict timelines, major depression is 2 weeks, but as we know, burnout can last more than 2 weeks. I think that sometimes people who are burnt out and have compassion fatigue may also have depression. I don't think they're mutually exclusive topics, so it is a possibility. Um, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the emotional component of burnout. Some people, it's really hard to digest that. Uh, I can't deal with all of this, and they might blame other people and say, oh, this person's putting too much work on me. So some people may blame others. Um, some people may feel burdened on themselves. So just that feeling of taking on everyone else's emotion can feel like a burden on us. Um, and also bottling up how we feel. So, that feeling of I'm alone in how I perceive this, and how I feel about this. Like no one else really understands. Um, and that can lead to these feelings of just having no control over our situation and feeling hopeless. We could also have a lack of I want to say pleasure in activities that we previously engaged in. So that feeling of like, yeah, I used to go for a walk outside and now I don't know, I just don't feel like it anymore. It just doesn't do the same thing for me. Um, and also just a lot of denial maybe. Like, hey, I'm okay. It's not that bad. Or, it is that bad and I'm really ashamed of how I feel. So we see that it can be quite a painful process to go through compassion fatigue.
So all of this, again, we're talking about physical, cognitive, emotional. What is that going to do? How is that going to affect our behavior, right? So it's all interconnected. So oftentimes what we see is sometimes people will complain about work or school, falling into those habits of, what's cathartic. And if you're a verbal processor, then you're more likely to possibly complain more. And I use that word with a grain of salt. It's not to be critical or anything. It's just to be aware that can happen. So that mindfulness piece, and then also we start to lose the sense of taking care of ourselves. Our self-care starts to just go out the window. And so again, tune into that. If you don't have something to look forward to every week, then maybe there's some insight there for you that, okay, I should sit down and figure out what I can do this week to actually bring some joy into my day and into my week. And then also what we tend to see behaviorally is either people will isolate. I know that's something that I tend to do, right? I would get home at the end of the day. I remember thinking back, I'd get home at the end of the day and I would just isolate. Like I wouldn't want to talk to anybody. I would just want to like chill by myself. And part of that is part of the, you're basically, I'm an extrovert, introvert. I need to have my alone time, but But if that becomes excessive, right, if you're isolating excessively and you're not seeing people, then that's a warning sign. The opposite of that is you might flood. You might end up, whatever's going on, you might end up either lashing out on people in your life, or you might end up, what I like to say, verbal vomiting, right? If something happened at work or you had a conversation with someone, then you'll start flooding people in your life with that information without necessarily being aware about where they're at and whether they can handle that information, right? Especially if they're not trained, to deal with that kind of potential trauma, right? Because again, compassion fatigue is accumulation of like sometimes is an accumulation of vicarious trauma or tertiary trauma that we hear from people in our circles related to our work, if we're healthcare providers or if we're constantly watching the news, right? That kind of thing. So the other thing is that you might fall into more excessive drug use or alcohol abuse. So being aware of your habits around that, or there might be a loss or a lack of routine. So if you start to notice you're not engaged in the types of routines that you typically would be, that are healthy and keep you on track, then that's a warning sign as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about this specific for those of you who are volunteers with us. So this is what I see. And I say this from the perspective of me being a volunteer and from the perspective of being a coordinator and dealing and talking to you guys all the time. So one thing is zoning out. You know how it is. You're on the call with somebody and you've spoken to them multiple times before and you start just, your mind is floating away. That might be one. Another one is frustration. You hear a story and you've heard it before and you just think, why doesn't this person do something about it? And you start vocalizing that. What might happen as a result of that, you might start pushing some options, telling the person, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? And at that moment, I think the call is becoming more about our frustration than it is the caller. And that's a sign that, you know what, maybe even within this call, I'm getting a little bit of a burnout here. And what I see with some people is that there's rumination instead of reflection. So I think it's very normal after you take a call as a volunteer or in any part of our lives that we're proud about and we want to do a good job of, we reflect after and we think, how could I have done this better? What did I do right? What did I do wrong? But when that starts playing into our minds for long periods of time after, and especially when it's accompanied by a feeling of heaviness, I think it's a sign that we're ruminating over, what has happened. And maybe if you notice that happening repetitively, that could be a sign of your own personal burnout, that, things are just sitting much heavier on you. And I will say a little bit about that is that doesn't necessarily have to be a shameful thing. You might have a lot other things going on in your life that might contribute to it. So it's not as a failure as a volunteer or not as a failure as you as a person. It's just that you have a lot to deal with. And that can cause you to just not look forward to it. If you don't feel good about what you do, you're not going to feel good, positive about it. And, we spoke about some of those emotions, like as I was going through this. So for those of you who feel this way, I want you to know we understand. So let's talk a little bit, and Roya is going to start this off, like how can we prevent this from happening and what are the signs that this is happening?
Yeah, so Natty and I were kind of talking about this and trying to explore the early warning signs. I went back to my background as occupational therapist, and this is a concept that we don't always apply to adults, but I think it's really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sensory system. I don't know how many people know about this, but we have 7 sensory systems. Okay, so kinesthetic processing, verbal processing, proprioceptive, tactile, auditory, right? So does this kind of make sense? So we take information in through these various systems. And so usually, I'll give you an example. If there was a child who had problem behaviors and I got an assessment to go and see this kid in the school, right? I'm seeing this referral and it says problem behaviors, right? That's typically the label that you'll put on that. And I go in, I might do a sensory profile with the clients, with the child's parents, get a sense of, what they tend to gravitate towards. Do they really love listening to loud music? Do they love throwing things? Do they love hugs? Are they constantly seeking out physical touch? And then I might go into a classroom, for example, and observe this kid in the classroom and see what they're doing. Are they pushing the desk? Are they throwing things across the room? Are they touching other people in the classroom and being problematic, right? But really, it's a kid who's trying to get their sensory needs met. So the idea here is that we know a lot about the sense. We talk a lot about it with kids. And so what happens to adults, we still have sensory needs. We still have this way of processing the world around us and regulating our nervous system, right? So this is my question. This is my question to you: is what type of processor are you? Okay, so that might be a question to actually reflect on, do some journaling on, and you can, some prompts. Are you somebody that values self-talk? Do you like verbally talking things out? Or do you like journaling? Is that something that helps you regulate? Or are you somebody who likes to hit gym, right? Are you somebody that likes to get their heart pumping? That would be more kinesthetic or proprioceptive. Or you do like walking, and there's extremes, right? Maybe you like speed walking, or running, or maybe you like playing sports. Or do you prefer to when things go wrong or when you're feeling stressed, do you like to put on music? So that would be an indication that you're more likely an auditory processor or an auditory regulator, I should say. And again, this is inferred, like we haven't done an assessment. I can't say whether or not you are, but it's inferred that if you gravitate towards certain activities, then you're likely trying to regulate your nervous system, consciously or not, through those activities. Or are you somebody that seeks out a lot of physical touch, right? Do you love getting hugs? And I know in COVID times, it's really, really hard. I've had a lot of clients actually speak to me a lot about this. And so this is a little trick I want to share with everybody. Did you actually know that hugging yourself can stimulate oxytocin? It can stimulate happy hormones, right? So simply like just doing this, your brain doesn't know the difference, right? So something like that. And there's a technique, and you're welcome to look into it. There's a link at the end of the webinar for you to watch a webinar by Dr. Kate Truitt, and she talks about the havening technique, okay? It's a really, really cool technique that really helps us, and she kind of talks about how, the simple action of that physical touch. And these are kind of the patterns that she discusses, right, that I'm doing right now, right? Even just the hands. Tell your amygdala, like it just calms the amygdala right down, okay? And you pair that, she explains it in more detail, but you can pair that with some kind of a mindful activity, right? So whether that's, thinking of your favorite movies while you're doing this havening, right? So, but she's kind of the expert on that. So that resource is available to you. Those are all really great ways. It's a really great strategy to help you tune into ways of preventing compassion fatigue. The next one is really quick, just nutrition and sleep, which of course you all know, sleep hygiene, making sure that you have a routine before bed, avoiding caffeine, right, at certain times, and limiting your screen time and other stimulating activities before you head to bed. Okay. And then of course there is an element around supplementation and diet. If you want to speak with a naturopath or functional medicine doctor to figure out your individualized kind of needs, right, from kind of more of an inside out perspective, like dealing with the physiological systems from a diet and supplementation standpoint, can also help.
And also communication and healthy boundaries. Boundaries are not easy. So, communicating what we need from a situation is not easy. It doesn't always feel great, but I think it's important to express what we need from our surroundings. Keeping the people in our life who we feel can really lift us and validate us is helpful. And clarifying, like if something doesn't work for you, it doesn't. And we're going to talk a little bit more about boundaries in the next slide. So,
Sorry, can I just want to respond to some of the comments that we're getting here. If that's okay. I just think it's so great. So we have people saying, just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So sometimes multiple demands place people in risk of imbalance in physical, emotional, social well-being. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And then stress chips is in my go-to. Oh, stress chips. Oh my goodness. Okay, got it. Sorry. That's my brain being slightly fatigued right now. Yeah. I'm gonna be real, right? Okay, so isn't this the same as, yeah, we talked about that. This is a great chart. I hope you don't mind. I took us. Oh no, we're so glad you did. That's why it's there. So great. Oh my goodness, I miss hugs too. Yes, getting a cat is good. I've thought about that, believe it or not.
Yeah, Shag, I like that idea. Something about the pets, like touching. It's, very helpful.
So good.
So let's dig in a little bit into these boundaries. So I mentioned that, it can be really tough creating those boundaries, but it is a form of self-compassion. And I think a lot of people view setting boundaries as an all or nothing, especially if it's around family and friends. Like you feel like, okay, what does a boundary mean? That I can't have them in my life? I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. I think just redefining it, so instead of being at your family for 5 hours, if that really stresses you out, can you be there for 2? Can you compromise to preserve yourself? And I think that is important, even though it doesn't feel right. And I will say a lot of people who experience compassion fatigue and burnout tend to be very hard on themselves and also tend to be people pleasers. So think about, does that sound like you? And maybe that's why it doesn't feel good to say no to other people. But you're important too. So it's okay to say no sometimes. Limiting news. I think Sally or someone or was it Laurie? Laurie mentioned about news and being bombarded by news. And yeah, I think that's a real thing, especially now we're bombarded with a lot of negativity from the world, and it's sad. And we internalize that sadness. So limiting news is important. Maybe changing environment as well. I find sometimes if I am working from home and I feel like, oh, I'm so fed up of being in my place, just going outside on the balcony for like a couple minutes can help reset. So just think about that. Like, even if you can't get outside, can you walk around? Just changing environments can be pretty helpful. And Roy is going to talk to us a little bit about common humanity versus isolation.
Mm-hmm. So this is actually, all of this this section is based on Kristen Neff's research. So we do have a link for you at the end if you want to look into her work. She's dedicated her career to understanding self-compassion. And a lot of the research here has actually shown that practicing these sorts of things in self-compassion, which is broken down into 3 key elements: self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and mindfulness versus sober identification. So these are the 3 key elements of practicing self-kindness. And if you can do this and improve your levels of self-kindness, then there's actually been a lot of research to show that it decreases symptoms of anxiety and depression. Okay, so improves psychological well-being. And so common humanity versus isolation is really the idea of recognizing that pain, suffering are realities of life that we all go through it. Okay, and sometimes we don't have control over pain and suffering, right? It's kind of the mystery of life is what cards are you going to get dealt today versus tomorrow, and what cards were you dealt with when you were born. And so and recognizing that we all have our deck of cards. We're all going through these barriers. We're not alone. And oftentimes what happens, and we're not compassionate with ourselves, or we feel isolation, we feel alone, is that we're not recognizing that we start to lose sight of the fact that there's a common human experience that happens that we all go through. And in just recognizing that and just saying, you know what, I'm feeling A, B, and C right now, and I'm feeling frustrated with the fact that I don't know, I broke my ankle this weekend, right? But then recognizing that, okay, you know what? A lot of people like this. My experience is valid. It's unique. It's completely valid. But I'm not going to be hard on myself because breaking an ankle is something that can happen, and it can happen to anybody, right? And so taking that feeling of isolation and grounding yourself in the fact that this is a common human experience, right? And so blaming situations and not people, okay? So that's including yourself. So if you're going through something, be kind to yourself, right? It's okay that, you know, it's like I broke my ankle, right? It's not that I'm broken. It's just that my ankle's broken right now. And if that kind of helps, that perspective of blaming the situation and not the people can be a really grounding way to practice common humanity. Some of the things that, you know, sometimes what I'll recommend, for example, to some of my concussion clients who are going through post-concussive syndrome and they're not recovering in the way that works, that typically they should based on trajectories, is I might recommend that they, you know, grab a book about, there's a lot of Dr. Norman Doidge, you know, I might recommend a couple of his books because he goes through a lot of case studies of people who have gone through mild to moderate brain injury, and he shows the journey. And so it's a way for my clients who are feeling isolated and alone to hear the stories of other people who have gone through a similar experience and how they've actually overcome it, right? So again, that's another way of practicing common humanity, right? So, and then of course, mindfulness versus over-identification. So your experience is valid, but try not to over-identify with the challenges you're going through, right? Be present, be in the moment, recognize that it's happening, but recognize it's a moment in time, and focus on the things that you're grateful for, right? There's a lot of research to show that simply practicing gratitude, which can be as simple as 3 things in the morning, 3 things at night that you're grateful for, right? And writing them down can just help us focus on feeling grounded, feeling centered, and not over-identifying with our experiences too much.
Okay, let's talk about this. Did I go back? Nope. So let's get a little bit more into prevention and self-care. So, Roya, what do we think about self-care?
All right, so self-care, basically here we're talking about sleep and nutrition. So a lot of this we already talked about, right? A lot of this is going back to that practicing kindness. So I want you to think about self-care as which element of practicing self-compassion does this fit into? Does this fit into self-kindness versus self-judgment? Does it go under common humanity, or is it going under mindfulness for you? So that's just something to think about in terms of remembering or learning how to associate these different concepts. And so sleep and nutrition, which we talked about, right? So hours of sleep versus quality. So some people can sleep for 8 hours, but is that really quality sleep? You know, if you're on your computer until 10 minutes before you go to bed, likely less quality than if you were to shut your computer off an hour before, right? The blue light can trigger your brain into thinking that it's actually still daytime, which is going to affect quality. And so, you know, sleep, again, we talked about sleep and then downtime, right? So there's a difference between sleep and rest, right? Sleep can be restful, but we also need time to actively rest. So what are you doing to build in that active rest time? Right. And that can be, you know, some people like to take a bath, right? Other people like to, whatever it is, practice your mindfulness meditation. Everyone's different, right? So, and you know, what works for you, right? Yeah. So that's the question, right? It's about making a commitment to prioritizing your hobbies and your interests is really, really important. Okay. So again, having that thing to look forward to every week or every month, can increase the joy and excitement, the anticipation can help, right? And so what we want to talk a little bit about, there's some ideas there that we listed for you. You can feel free to read those. What's interesting, I don't know if you know this, but laughter has been shown to decrease the pain response. Right? So that was something I was really intrigued by personally when I read into that, right? Because my body tends to alert me with increases in pain. So I thought, oh, I'm gonna use this to my advantage. So I make an effort, for example, to watch, I don't know if you know Trevor Noah, but I find him hilarious. So I'll watch, some of his stand-up every so often because he just gets me laughing so hard, right? So it's kind of those little hacks that you think will work for yourself and just prioritizing that.
I see Mahendra's asking something, and I'll get to it. He said, what about belief in spirituality? It's interesting you said that, and I'll tell you why. Because when I talk about what volunteers can do, I'll hit that spirituality point on the third one. But one thing is get support. If you feel like you're burning out, if you feel like heavy, talk to your network. We know a lot of what it's like to be there, so don't be afraid to reach out to us. Also, if you are on the same shift all the time, you're probably encountering the same stories quite a lot. So switching the shifts around to see if you get a little bit more variety and you feel a little bit more energized can be helpful. The other thing is, and Roya mentioned this, is that finding what works for you is a journey. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. So I think it's important to figure out what you're passionate about and do more of it. A caller recently actually asked me, how do you find happiness in your life? And I said, you're not going to like my answer. And he said, why not? I said, because there's no one answer for everyone. Funny, recently, I had that call quite recently, and just prior to that call, I had started taking this course online, and it's called The Science of Well-Being. So you guys, there's a link for it if you are interested in it. It's a free course. It's actually Yale's most popular course right now. What it does is very early on in the course, there's this great survey you can take, and you answer a lot of questions, and at the end of it, it pinpoints for you what are your top, I think, 3 to 5 strong points. So what is it that for you brings you fulfillment? And for me, my number one was spirituality. So it's interesting that Mahendra said that. And what it does is, it makes it very unique to you because it breaks down the top 3, and then it tells you a little bit about that trait and what you can do to engage more in that trait and find your own personal fulfillment. So I find that is really helpful and very unique. And I hope everybody does think about what makes them passionate and how they can do more of it. And I think we are close to the end here. We've put up a couple resources that we've talked about throughout our session today. So those are up there if you guys would like the links for them. And we also have some self-assessments. So if you're wondering, am I burnt out? Like, what's really going on here? You can try taking these and seeing where you're actually at. So those are the self-assessments that we've put up for you. And if you like anything we said, you have comments that you prefer to share privately, maybe you want to talk a little bit more with us, that's the contact information for Roya and myself, and we'll be happy to engage with all of you, if that's something you'd like. So,
Thank you, ladies. We still have a few minutes, so if anybody has any other questions, I'm sure feel free to send them in the chat, and Roya and Nadia will be more than happy to answer them since we have a few minutes. Again, thank you so much, ladies, for such an informative webinar tonight. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight's webinar. We hope you found it informative, helpful, and enjoyable. Thank you for sharing your unique knowledge and insights with us this evening, ladies. And once again, I want to thank our sponsor, Pace Law, for their generous support. Just to let everyone know, the next The webinar will be on October 15th, so please mark your calendars and check your folders, especially your spam folders for the invite if you haven't received it yet. And before concluding, I think we'll just wait a minute or two to see if there's anyone else that wants to add any last-minute thoughts or questions.
Sarah asked for the resource slide, so we put that back up. Thank you guys for sharing as well, everybody who's here listening in. It's nice to see everyone participate and offer some of your answers for these questions too.
Yeah, it looks like the links will be shared with the webinar recording, which will be sent out. So if anyone's, didn't get a chance to write down any of the links, they will be mailed out to you guys. And I want to personally thank you guys, Nadia and Roya. It's not easy to come on and speak about your personal experiences. So thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that. And I found it super helpful. I know a lot of volunteers who are volunteering and taking shifts regularly. There's we do heavy work, right? So it's really important to make sure that we reach out and get the support that we need to ensure that we're okay to be able to help other individuals.
Thank you, Raji.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it looks like there are no more questions, so we'll end the webinar tonight. I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Have a good night, everyone.